There we go. Did you have any sort of set formula you wanted to go through, or just ask me a series of questions? Or
I don't really have questions formatted. I just thought it would be a conversation, a discussion about some of your takes on behavioral psychology, and I suppose how that intersects with the book that I'm writing, which is, I suppose it's about political overreach and the overreach of big pharma and how that impacts our mental health. And I suppose I'm also I'm delving at the moment into the history and seeing, like, what is this? I suppose the deep state, and how long has it been in existence for, and so on. But I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not expecting to kind of go into that in depth.
Sure.
But yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, we can start off around the behavioral science, because the key with the behavioral science is it's really understanding the mechanism by which you can influence another person. I mean, that's really key, because if we look what's gone on for thousands of years, and if we look at the commonalities, it's effectively the establishment. So it's a group of people that want to have power over another group of people. And that's really what it's about. Do the people have the power, or do the establishment have the power? And in monarchies, it's very clear. In the old days, 2,000 years ago, the monarchy had the power and the people did as they told. Dictatorships are the same. The democracies, in my opinion, parade as the people having the power, but in reality, they don't. It's, there's the quote that Graham Hancock says that dictatorships rule by force, democracies rule by manipulation of the public's perception.
Indeed. So you just said 2,000 years of monarchy. I mean, is that how long you feel that kings have been holding power?
Well, I think
are you talking about in Europe or Britain, or?
Well, I think that's just when you look at any civilization that has a pyramid structure in its organization, you're generally going to see the power centralized at the top. So people ruling over other people. And, people got fed up with that and started rebelling and revolting. And of course, it's just taken on a different form. 2,000 years ago, whether you did as you were told because someone forced violence, now you do as you're told because you have to earn money to make a living.
I like to think that sort of in between times, and still sort of perhaps up until perhaps about 500 years ago, when the Enclosures Acts in the UK started, the land theft, which stole approximately a fifth of the land surface of the UK from the commoners, who owned it before. So they were the indigenous peoples. So this is only going back 500 years. And I like to think that indigenous cultures, perhaps up until that point, had quite a large degree of sovereignty. I mean, perhaps not absolutely.
I think that's true. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think when you look at, it's really to do with the way a society is structured. So you see a lot of tribes where they have different structures. I know I've read about certain tribes where they wouldn't actually go to war unless the female elders voted on it. They were wise enough to know that the male energy had testosterone, the warrior instincts. And so I think there's the level of awareness on how we govern, and the level of awareness in a lot of the tribes and cultures was not to fool oneself, because it's really key. The Richard Feynman, who in my opinion was an absolute genius, who won the Nobel Prize for quantum mechanics, I think it was quantum electromechanics, he made a very bold statement that said we have to be careful not to fool ourselves, and we're the easiest ones to fool. And this is what's really prevalent, is that the way we think about things is that the wisdom of a lot of the elders in the tribes would know how the young mind would fool itself. That makes sense. So they would design their systems to work. And I think this is one of the key points, is that in my mind, when I look at what's going wrong with society, why behavioral science is able to have such an effect, one of the most important things is this thing called misattribution. And really what it is attributing something incorrectly to being a different cause than it actually is. And the foundations of this are so important and so key, is it's very easy with the human mind to misattribute things. For instance, the most fundamental thing that we misattribute is when someone does a certain behavior, we attribute it to their personality rather than the situation. Yet when we do a certain behavior, we attribute it more to the situation than our personality. That makes sense? So in this fundamental error in how we look at behavior, we don't take into consideration how situations affect the way we behave. And they massively
justify ourselves. So what I'm hearing is that we justify ourselves. We've always got a reason, even if we behave badly. Yeah. But if someone else behaves badly, that's an indictment of their character.
Yes, that's the fundamental error. And what you have within that is then we have this objectivity illusion. The first part of that is the way that we see things. And this is really the way our brains function. And when we understand how our brains function and we know thyself better, then, and this is what the wisdom of the elders would do in situations, they would understand this, so they would realize, you know, the real truth of the matter, and they would design their situations and societies to be successful, to have a balance, etc. But the societies we're functioning now, in my opinion, a lot of them are doomed to fail, and they're designed not to succeed. It's a bit like a game of Monopoly. So a game of Monopoly that people don't realize, that was actually created as an activist, by an activist in protest at the property laws. Okay, because she was showing how they're ludicrous and how they favor, you know, the wealth from the previous generation. Now that then turned into a game that people then celebrated playing. And that's the thing. The game, or what we often call the frame, is massively important, because when you start playing a game, you then start playing by the rules, and often you don't question if the rules are fair. So basically the banking system destroys so much wealth of all the small businesses, but because it's a game they're playing, they're not aware that they don't have, well, we shouldn't have to play it. So look at the game of Monopoly. Basically what happens is that the name of the game is to bankrupt everyone else and get ownership of everything. The name of the game is not to live in harmony and not to help your fellow players, all those things. So we now have in the world at the moment, we have a game where you have a number of megalomaniacs playing a game of Monopoly with the Earth's resources, the people, and nature. And their game is not to benefit the people. And when we understand the game that they're playing, they obviously have to tell us it benefits us, because we wouldn't play it otherwise. It's a bit like
I heard today in the news that in America the Senate has turned down a $48 billion package to help small businesses.
Yeah.
And in the very same space of time, they have agreed to a $40 billion bailout for the Ukraine, $40 billion worth of support. So what does that tell you about American government, for example?
Yeah. Well, there's another bias that goes on, is that we have things that go on where we, as humans, we tend to not, we're wired to believe, but we're also wired to lie. Okay, this is what happens. So when you get people that are quite happy to lie and know they're lying and not worry about it and deceive themselves, then the majority of people will believe them, because there's some very famous studies on the word because. And what it shows is if you can give someone a reason, even if the reason is complete nonsense, they will often go along with your suggestion. So they had these studies where they'd have people queuing at a photocopier, and someone would come along and say, oh, can I jump in? And only so many people, I think it was like 60% of people let them jump in. But if they said, can I jump in because, then the compliance went up to like 95%. Even if they said, because I need to make some copies. Everyone needs to, that's the whole point, they're standing there.
Yeah.
So what you've got is that as humans, we often respond to triggers rather than the substance. And in fact,
I could even say that it's before human beings, because you could argue that nature has thrived sometimes on misinformation. For example, a stick insect is portraying itself as a stick, but that is misinformation. But it succeeds in being camouflaged on a branch.
Yeah, well, you see, the thing is, it's really interesting thing, because you've got things like triggers. So triggers is really how a magician is able to deceive people, because we don't respond to the thing itself, we respond to triggers within the thing. For instance, the famous study at the start of Cialdini's book, of Science and Practice of Influence, where they have baby turkeys that will move towards the mother, but then they put a toy dressed as a predator in there, and then the turkeys move away from it. But if they get the predator toy to make the noise of the mother, they move towards it. So there's certain triggers that will override the visual information, the auditory information. And of course, we respond to triggers. And what's really fascinating about this is that, it's a misattribution that we often won't consciously realize. So there's so much of what's going on at the moment that happens below our conscious awareness that's deeply affecting us. And it's only when we bring it into conscious awareness, which always isn't enough, but at least then we know there's a problem. And one example would be society, for the most part, from what we can see, is based on false fixes. So what that is, most companies are literally designing their products to meet your wants, but not your needs. Because if they meet your needs, then you won't consume as much, you won't need as much. But if they meet your want, but keep you hungry for more, then you go around this cycle like a hamster on a wheel.
So basically what you're saying is creating an addiction in a person is the best business model in a capitalist society?
Yes. Yeah, and it's a compulsion loop. So it doesn't even have to be an addiction. You could argue whether a compulsion loop is an addiction, but the game makers, they understand this deeply. So you watch people playing Candy Crush, and it's very similar to a pigeon pecking at, buttons and lights that Skinner did many years ago, is that the person begins to lose control of themselves, because what's going on is that the brain that responds to the reward center, the dopamine hits or whatever, thinks it's doing something very worthwhile. It makes sense. And they design, like there was a book years ago called Reality is Broken about game design. The game designers understand this so well that they can keep someone engaged for 5-6 hours playing a stupid game when that person might have, children or pets or whatever in need of assistance.
But why would you say that the limbic brain, the emotional brain, presumably that is controlled by things like dopamine and hormones and so on, why does that trump the frontal cortex, the rational brain that is able to decipher and to make choices based on rational thought? I would have thought that this frontal brain that can do all this complex stuff, that has probably meant that we've come to the top of the food chain. Why doesn't that trump the limbic brain, in your opinion?
Well, it could do. You see, this is the complexity of the matter. And it's highly, highly complex. And as Brett Weinstein said on the conference, when you have complex data like this, the first thing you really have to do is work out how you're going to look at it. Yeah. And what you have with the behavioral science guys is they're looking at it from how they can create situations to create the outcome. So when it comes to the emotional part of the brain, my opinion from all the research I've done is it's all to do with safety. And the really Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that you won't be able to do certain things if the organism is under threat. Yeah. So if
you're under threat, you're activated, you're in fight or flight, you've got adrenaline and cortisol and things going around the system. Yeah. And therefore, actually, this part of the brain, the frontal cortex, is too slow if it's a survival situation. So it shuts down.
Yeah, exactly. So what you've got the emotions will always override logic, because I think really from these safety catches, and I think a lot of it doesn't actually make sense it's a bit like we have so much data coming in that we can't possibly process it all. And it's almost as though they can't rely on the logic. So you've got this sort of safety catch. It's a bit like the smoke alarm going off in the kitchen, when there's no, it's just a little bit of smoke goes up, that the alarm's going to go, okay, we can't risk, not alarming. So it kind of triggers it. And you'll see
and I suppose people think that that dopamine is not the same as adrenaline, because dopamine is like you're actually reaching a goal, but I suppose dopamine is still part of the same primitive system that is based on reward, and it probably, like, dopamine probably evolved through hunting and like reaching a target, or the mechanism for mating and this type of thing. So it's still a very kind of primitive response that's governed by our hormones.
Yeah, well, it's different from the fight or flight, but it has a very important purpose, in that if you couldn't produce dopamine, you couldn't motivate yourself to do anything. So basically, dopamine is there for, me as an organism to sit here, and then I could sit here for like 2 days just doing nothing, unless dopamine really said, well, okay, we've got to eat. So the sort of, when I eat, then I get this dopamine hit, so then I feel good. So it's really to motivate me to do things, to reproduce, to eat, to live, to do all these things. That's what dopamine is for. Obviously, serotonin and your needs being met is a slightly different process. And the point is that historically, getting your dopamine to get your wants met your needs. And it's only in a modern society that companies and magicians and everyone else has been able to manipulate these pathways that you get what you want, but it doesn't meet your need. So this is the thing. And of course, if you look at the studies they've done with rats, and there's various mice and rat studies that are very telling. So they wired a mouse's brain up to a button that when they press the button, the mouse got a hit of dopamine. Okay. So then what happened? The mouse sat there and pressed the button until it died. It did nothing else. If they put food into the cage, it wouldn't move to get it because it had no need to, because it's got its dopamine from hitting the button. If they brought the food up to its mouth and put it sort of near its mouth, then it would eat. So the dopamine, really, to look at it, is this motivation to get you to move, to get you to do things. Now,
what's the difference between dopamine and, you mentioned serotonin, and then oxytocin? So to my mind, and I know that oxytocin is complex and it meets lots of different criteria, but one of the things is that it's a bonding hormone. So you could say that this is not the wants, this is the actual needs being met when oxytocin is flowing, because that's when we're in face-to-face contact in real time, when there's real bonding going on.
Yeah, well, you see, I mean, I don't look at these chemicals in too much detail because I get to the sort of macro level that I know it as deeply as I need to know it. So from my understanding, serotonin is really the sort of contentment chemical. So it's to stroke your dog, it's to smell the roses, it's to appreciate the birds, spend time with your children. This is what we really have as our needs, our deep needs. So serotonin is really connected to that.
Serotonin and oxytocin as well?
They're subtly different, because oxytocin, you're right, is the bonding hormone. Now, from some of the studies I looked at, is that, it's really to tell a species, this is yours, offspring, look after it. So it's to create this sort of bubble, if it will, to bring things together. Now, then when people would, animals or whatever would mate together, the bonding hormone would keep them connected. And what's interesting about oxytocin is that there are studies that show that the oxytocin will break with the first offspring when the second one's born, in order to then allow it to bond with the second one and look after that. So it's quite a complex hormone. I know that they want people to release oxytocin before they advertise things to them, because when you experience an oxytocin, you're much more malleable, you're much more open to purchase and all these things. But I think from a society design process, what you've got companies creating false associations in our mind. So we think that if we buy an iPod or whatever, then we're going to feel good about ourselves and all these things. And it's an itch that you can't scratch. So what you have is this constant yearning and wanting. But what happens is, particularly with food, is if we build a program, and it really is almost like a computer program where we say, right, don't feel good so then whatever, you would build up an emotion, we need an outlet, so we go and eat some food, it changes the way we feel. So then the dopamine happens, that loop gets closed, but it never really solves the problem. So then you find yourself like a hamster running around these wheels. And really it's the misattribution again, because your brain is basically misreading your need and then giving you a solution that it thinks works. Now, then if you try to break this, the safety catch will kick in and not allow you to break it. So I was talking to a person the other day who's had a couple of articles published that were really good on the HPA axis. And we were talking about the programs that are running that are causing most of the problems today. And you've got these programs that are running that says to people, I have a need. If I do this, then need gets met. But that program's a faulty program. And that's why
you're talking about the neurological programs in a human body. You're not talking about computer programs, although you're talking about the way that computer programs are able to hack our neurobiology and trick us.
Well, there's two different things there, but they're both important. So one of them, yes, the first one is really the programs. I'm talking about a cognitive pathway. So, if I think about a line of thinking I would take, that would be a pathway. The more I think that, the more it becomes embedded. We become creatures of habit. But what will often happen is it will be beyond our awareness what's going on. So we'll run a program, a bit like if you go to shake someone's hand, they will just bring their hand up and go to shake you. Now, the reason this is really key is because these programs, when they run so much, they become background programs and they're running without our knowledge. So then if we look at, and then what we talk about is things like meta programs. So meta programs are really just something that runs, meta means above. And when you talk to someone, and the classic meta programs at work, and there's 4 that are around group dynamics, around group communication. So if you talk to someone and you challenge the narrative and they believe the narrative, you will usually get into one of 2 dynamics. It will either be combative or competitive. Okay. Now that you effectively can never communicate well in one of those dynamics. Okay. The only dynamic you can ever really communicate well in is cooperative, because you're effectively saying we're part of the same tribe. We need to work together. If the groups see each other as opposite tribes, then all the studies show they ignore each other and they combat each other. But the preconditions for that are feeling safe, and so therefore also when you're feeling safe, you're able to engage this part of the brain, the frontal cortex, the newest part of the brain, which allows us to engage, be creative, and navigate reality and negotiate with each other in a meaningful, embodied way. Yeah, and of course that is an important prerequisite. But then you've got how we see the other person and how they see us. And if we see each other as opposition, then we're literally going to entrench into our perspectives, and we're going to try and convince them, and they're going to try and convince us. And that comes on to the 3 aspects of this objectivity illusion. But just one last point on these meta programs, which is really key. There's an invisible program running for most of the public that's causing most of the problems. And this is what's known as a suppletive program. And it's effectively the program that a child will be in for the first 5 or 6 years of its life, which is, totally responsible, all, to the parent. So the parent has complete power to make all the decisions for the child because it needs nurturing. It can't live for itself. We're one of the few species that when born, if you left, a child up to 5 or 6, cannot fend for itself. So what happens is the parent is the big and the child is the small, and the parent has all the power and the child does as they're told. And then there comes a point, usually around 5 or 6, where the child maybe even earlier, the child starts going no. Then it breaks out of this pattern of complete surrender. This pattern is running for most people with their relationship between them and their government. They just assume that the government has all the power. Yeah. And what you'll find is that what's going on with that pattern is that many people are just doing as they're told. Now, you'll see this pattern get elicited, and it's really this sort of if you think someone has authority over you and you believe that, you'll just do whatever they say. And Milgram showed this very powerfully. A lot of the time, even if you find out that what they're doing is bad, you still will do what they want you to do, 65% of the people. Now, the social experiment guy, Danny, he did some things where he'd walk into a park in London with a tannoy and a yellow vest, and he'd just start shouting, "Excuse me, all of you over there, you need to move over to this side of the park." And people just got up and moved. Do you see what's going on there? It's an unconscious pattern that people are not aware to question authority.
But I wonder how deep that pattern is. And some of the research I've been doing just today on Substack is looking at the Prussian education system and how that's influenced the European education system, and how it was based on a military model of taking human beings and preparing them to be soldiers and to follow orders, because a soldier who disobeys orders is not going to be a successful soldier. So potentially this model of hear and obey is quite new in terms of the fact that it perpetuates into adulthood. It could be that elders that you were talking about earlier, that they might have actually encouraged free thinking, and they might have encouraged us to be sovereign beings. And that might only be as recent as 250 years ago. Just to contextualize it so that we don't sort of give up hope, so that we realize to what extent we've been tampered with, but also that in terms of the time frames of the human race, it's a blip. All this tampering is actually potentially a very, very small blip. I don't know what you think of that.
Yeah, well, it's out of our true nature. See, this is the thing, because a lot of it comes from literally learning. So the point of putting it in the school is really the indoctrination programs to teach people. So we learn, but we learn so much about what we learn from observation. So we just watch what everyone else is doing and copy it. We build these programs, these habits. But this is where the higher state of consciousness really comes into it. So if you show someone this, if you were true, you can't tell them, because if you tell them, they just shut it down and rationalize why they believe what they believe, because it will be a threat to their system, the safety kicks in, etc., etc. But if you can show them in such a way, if you can first prime to elicit this questionable part of their mind where they start looking at things and question them, and then you're able to show them, and this is really key, and it takes a while to explain what this is, but there's a big difference between show and tell, and filmmakers know this, and this is why the films and the adverts are so powerful, because they don't tell you to go and buy something until the end of the advert. They show you, they build the associations, all these things. This pattern is running so unconsciously that if people, for instance, if somehow in like one of these movies, they had a broadcast and they was able to really show people this pattern in a very powerful way, you would see probably an absolute change overnight, because it would reach the collective consciousness. Anyone in, what we would probably collectively call the truth movements or the sovereign movements or the freedom movements, any of these things, those people have said, right, I want my power back. I'm not going to listen to some, and that's what's going on. So you've got this pulling of the power back. Now, it's a bit like a leech, actually. These things really suck out the energy of people. But there was one other point I was going to make about this. So if you look, I regularly meet with experts on all different fields, because my role really is to go across all the different fields to build some models to show people things. But in order to do that, I have to talk to lots of experts who have a very in-depth knowledge of their particular field. People really only need to have a certain level of understanding to make their decisions. That makes sense. So I was talking to a gentleman the other day who works with animals and particularly primates and gorillas. And we were talking about Pavlovian classical conditioning versus operant conditioning, etc. And he showed me a video that was really powerful, that's been replicated in so many different species and really looks to be apparent in the human species as well, is that they had two gorillas, and they would give them a reward for whatever they did, hand them a rock or whatever. If they gave both gorillas a piece of cucumber, both monkeys were okay. Yeah. But if they then gave one of them a grape and the other one a cucumber, the one that receives the cucumber then throws it back, because this inherent unfairness about what's going on triggers something in them. So what you've got is you've got these states of minds that we will literally enter in response to our experience. So what anyone who's directing a situation is able to do, whether it be a person directing an advert, making a movie, or the teacher in a classroom, they are able to create conditions and situations where most people, they can walk people through an experience and they can create a learning. So what one teacher did very famously, it was the day after, I think, Martin Luther King got assassinated, where she was in a classroom and she basically divided the groups into blue-eyed and brown-eyed people. And then she told the class that the blue-eyed people were more intelligent. So it created this divide and conquer. And then she switched it around, managed to create the same thing. So you can create these conditions, and they only need, so you can create these situations that often need 3-4 conditions present, and then you get people act in a certain way. And what they was able to do in another classroom was install learned helplessness in about 20 minutes. So what you'll find is that as humans, we respond very much to our environment, and it's a combination of our personality, our history, our moods, experiences, all these things combined with the situation that will create outputs.
And yet there is quite a large amount of resilience, because I forget the source, but I learned, I wish I could remember the source, but it was a CIA experiment with humans, trying to reduce them to kind of programmable objects, if you like, and they gave them a lot of electric shocks and a lot of LSD. Well, that was their methodology, but it failed. They never managed to kind of turn us into programmable. But perhaps that's just one experiment, because I have to say that I don't hold out much hope in some respects. And that is like the scariest thing about the pandemic for me was always the level of compliance, and going into supermarkets and things and seeing 99% of the people wearing masks and all that. For me, that's actually more scary than the political thing.
But you see, this was all driven by a few simple things that can really be solved if we have enough people understanding how this works. Because most of the time, what's going on is that most people are not consciously aware of what's really going on. So I think it was Carl Jung that said that nearly all the evil in the world is done because man is hopelessly unconscious. Okay, when you suddenly be conscious, when you're suddenly made aware of something that you're doing that's creating a certain output, most of the time we change. It's really that, and it's not as simple as that, but being consciously aware of something is massively important. If you're banging your head against a wall and you don't realize that's causing the headache, then that's a problem. So a lot of this is to do with consciousness. Now, what you've seen throughout the pandemic is that the level of people wearing masks has gone down substantially, okay, even to the point when they were still wanted them, because what you find is that these behavioral science things will always create massive blowback, and a series of lies built on each other will eventually collapse. They always have through history. You also got this thing of collective consciousness, which really is a very powerful thing, morphogenic fields, etc., is that once a few people become aware, and a bit like the 100 monkeys, the rest of the group starts to get access to that. And if they are able, and for me, what's really important is knowing how to resonate in such a way that the people around you can start to see and understand it. What has been one of the biggest problems is that, coming back to that objectivity illusion, is that number one, we think that our perspective is correct and everyone else just needs to share it. Okay, whether it be taste, preferences, food, likes, colors, all these things, we just think we got the right way and everyone else. So why do those people eat that sort of food? They need to eat the same as us. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we have undue optimism about how people only have to see what we know and they will believe what we believe. Okay. The third thing is that if they don't agree with us, they're stupid. So we negatively attribute someone else's behaviors if it's not the same as the. So that really is three things, hurdles that we have to overcome, because that's how our brain functions. When we overcome that, and that's, for me, that's the sort of wisdom that a lot of the elders would have, is they'd understand this. They'd know that the brain, they're not the brain. There's a consciousness that's bigger than the brain. They can never really find where consciousness exists, whether it's non-local or whatever. But when we understand that, then we can start to present information and talk to others, so then they can really become conscious. Because if we don't, it turns out that many of the things that we do will actually make them resist the new information.
I would say that there's even like a fourth thing that comes into play that perhaps, I don't know if it was part of what you said or not just now, but it's like the fear of us appearing stupid, and which goes back to what we were talking about before about safety. Like for my brother even to potentially, my brother's like one of the most intelligent people that I know, but him and all his family have been vaccinated. And, like when we have discussions about this, he gets the Guardian up and shows me the statistics. Now, for him to kind of take on board that perhaps the BBC and the Guardian and all these institutions that he derives his sense of safety, belonging, security, identity from, that he's done for the last 50 years, for him to be able to kind of like recalibrate that, it's like it's too big. And also, like, he's a family man, he's a father, he works full time, he's responsible. It's like, they've kind of got us locked into our responsibilities, and in such a way that the destabilizing is not just economic and cultural on a global scale. It's kind of like, the individual perhaps can't afford to be destabilized when they're the head of the family, for example. Maybe he just needs to keep on keeping on.
Yeah, well, the thing is, what they've done is they've, people pushing an agenda. If you work out if you understand a situation and you understand what people respond to, and then you start controlling all those variables, you effectively can control what people think. So, for instance, we've got a number of hardwired programs and we've got a number of software, so things we've learned. Authority, social proof, scarcity, these are hardwired into us to evolve, to survive. So historically, if you had thousands of people together, there would be the strongest ones and the most knowledgeable ones would become the authorities, and then the group would rely on that person to survive because they would know where to go. Essentially, they would a lot of the time be the most knowledgeable. Yeah. So if you were in a farming culture, the person that had the most knowledge in a farming culture would be the authority of the group. They would be wise to listen to them rather than, learn from scratch.
And actually, the most generous people in cultures that barter and the economy, pre-money, pre-tokens like that, actually, generosity was considered to be one of the biggest virtues. And when you're generously distributing your things, and if you're a hunter-gatherer or a nomad, possessions become burdens as well. So actually, generosity is your best insurance policy. And that's a totally different model to the current prevailing capitalist model.
Yeah, and I remember talking to Bruce Lipton about this, and I do believe that he did something on survival of cooperation versus survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is a shitty model, and it doesn't really hold true. Like if it was truly survival of the fittest, you'd get people going out there mugging everyone and burglaring and all this. It's not that sense.
But isn't that the current political system that we've got? We have got the politicians mugging everyone. I mean, how can Congress in the US pass a bill where 40 billion package is being given to the Ukraine, and how can they deny a 48 billion package being given to their own people and small businesses to recover from COVID? How can that even happen? How could it happen? It is happening.
Because it's all down to vested interest. That's what it's all about. And I know that this happens on smaller scales and larger scales everywhere. But if the politician is serving special interests rather than the people, then the policy is going to be completely different. I would hasten that most politicians don't really serve. And it comes down to a few, it's a complex thing, but there's certain things that are really key. There's Goodhart's law. Goodhart's law says that if you have a measure becomes a target, it stops becoming a good measure. And this is how people start gamifying the system. So, you know, if it comes to patients in the NHS, for instance, or anything like this, the true measure should be the success and the health of people, but it doesn't become that. It becomes how many people have I discharged versus blah, blah, blah. So then that becomes the focus. So if you have a politician, what's his focus? To get re-elected. It's not to serve, you know what I mean? So the focus, so if getting re-elected is the focus, and then getting re-elected is much more successful if they accept corporate donations, it allows them to advertise more. So then that always comes with a cost and a, you know, and strings. Then you see the whole system in that the intentions and the reasons to have something change. Makes sense? So the forces at play, and this is always the key with me, when you look at the situation, what forces are at play? So if you walk into a shop and, you know, say it was during the first lockdown, and you've got someone on the door going, oh, you need to wear a mask. The forces are at play is his responsibility to the people paying his wages. Okay. His responsibility is not to serving me as a customer or fellow human being. He will argue that it's for the greater good, and that's, again, just their excuse. But then when you look via these energy companies, yeah, say they send someone round and they start changing, you know, say you've got a lady with 5 kids, single parent, and they change the meter over to a prepaid meter, so it's going to be more expensive. Again, the person's just doing their job, but it's not in service to the public. It's in service to special interests. So
the Nuremberg Code says that it's not after the Second World War, specifies that it's not enough of a reason to say that you were just doing your job.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where you've got this disconnect between what people think. I mean, I remember Australia. See, there's so many, and again, it's misattribution, it's misunderstanding. In Australia, they've got this rule that, well, it's not even a rule, it's a recommendation that when you walk into a retail store, they can look in your bags. Okay. They can't. Legally, they can't look in your bag, but it's the retail group social. So they pretend it's a law. They then put signs up on the wall that says, you know, we have the right to look in your bag, which is lying. So I remember walking to a shop and the guy would say, I want to look in your bag. I say, no, you can't. Oh, I have to. No, you don't. I have the right to. No, you don't. He says, look, it's written on the wall. I said, well, what does that mean? I could write anything and put it on the wall. Does that make it a law? So when we walk, so this is the thing about this blind respect for authority, as Einstein said, is one of the biggest problems that causes so many evils. Is that if you walk into a park and someone's just put a few signs on the wall, what gives that power?
So how deep is this obedience to authority, and what chances do we have of being able to overcome this? I mean, is it in the limbic brain, or is it in the primitive brain, or is it in the frontal cortex?
Well, that's a good question. Where it actually lies, I don't know if we need to know that, but I do know that more and more people are becoming aware, and that's the key. And of course, what happens is that we also run emotionally releasing sessions, that what you'll have is that someone will realize that they don't want to, you know, they don't respect authority anymore, but they might still feel the emotional strings of it. And I'll give you an example. So one of the ladies in one of our groups was handing out flyers outside the schools. And what happened was the headmistress came out and said, oh, you know, can you come into my office? And she said to me, she said, David, it was literally like I was 8 again. And I was sitting there, you know, at the mercy, because that's a pattern that just runs. Now, we can actually break those patterns if we wish to. We can also release the emotions there. And then what happens is we get freedom. And this is what it's about. It's freedom from the chains of our own mind and what's going on. And in fact, most of the chains are now invisible. Historically,
can I speak to that for a moment?
Yeah.
So there's a great 4-part series by Adam Curtis called 100 Years of the Self. And in that, he describes the monetization of the sort of personal growth movement, starting with EST, which then transformed into the Landmark Forum. And it was also influenced by Carl Rogers and the person-centered counseling movement and so on, which has many good intentions in its heart. But nonetheless, it monetized the idea of growth. And you could say that NLP and even some of the work that you do, it sells enlightenment as a discrete thing that you can pay for. But I think that is like deeply illusory and deeply problematic. And it has brainwashed us to forget that the source of safety and security is actually to be found in the collective. And that's what our limbic brain knows. And it's only the kind of duping of consumerism that has persuaded us anything to the contrary. It's actually when you were saying that face-to-face meeting at the beginning of I think before you even pressed record, face-to-face meeting is deeply important. And I think it rewires our nervous systems for secure attachment. And it's when we feel securely attached that we are able to find courage and to overcome our fears and to know that there is genuine safety in numbers. And so somehow we have to get away from this tech-mediated existence, even although it's incredibly helpful. We have to, as the elders did and as primitive societies did, we have to stay connected face to face for the sake of resilience, for the sake of courage.
Yeah, but you see, there's a number of points in there, Françoise, and it's important to break them out to point by point. So Est and those guys, in my opinion, don't follow sound principles of self-empowerment. So if you look on the courses that they do, they effectively tell you to follow all the rules without questioning them. Okay, which is no person of any high awareness would say that. I actually ended up having an argument with one of the ladies at the Landmark staff where she's telling me to blindly follow rules, and I'm saying, well, that's how Hitler and everything else happened.
They call it being coachable. They say that you have to be coachable. If you're not willing to be coachable, you get your full refund, but they will throw you off the course. I've done a lot of Landmark as well, and I think there's a lot of good in Landmark. But that's how they couch it, and that you have to be coachable, which you could say like in the positive sense, they're trying to get you to be open to new ideas. That's how they present it.
But here's the thing: where's the power lie? So the stuff that I do, in my opinion, is very different. I never take power off anyone, okay? Because I don't want to be responsible for someone else. It's not my role. So mine is always about showing someone for them to take their power back. Now, coming back to that emotional thing was really key, because I think the self-development thing is gone off at a tangent here, because it's not, self-development really is about a person developing their self. If they have to pay tens of thousands of dollars in courses, then that really just shows you that's not self-development. That's basically guru worship, et cetera, et cetera. I've always had a big problem with people when they start charging $5,000 for 3-day course. It's like, how can you do that? That's not the right structure, in my opinion. And it really
absolutely,
is
absolutely. And I'm sorry if it sounded like a personal attack.
No. I wanted to unwrap it because
it's a very interesting conversation. I'm really pleased we're unpacking it.
Yeah, that's the key, is to unpack it, because you should be able to challenge anyone. So I literally have it that people come on my thing. As long as I get the opportunity to unpack it and respond, that's fine. But I'll answer any question. People can ask me any question. I hope that really comes across, and we have it. And because of the way we set the frame up, those 4 meta programs, we set the frame up as being cooperative. Then when I deal with people, there's this equal power. I don't have more power than anyone else. It's this equal footing of collaboration and communication and fairness. So if ever I'm doing a session, so I'm doing a paid session with someone, it should be totally fair. And I always have this thing, 100% money back, all that kind of stuff, which I know some of these other groups do, but they don't. The Landmark always left a bad taste in my mouth, because a thing should sell itself, in my opinion. In marketing, I'm not a big fan of, but there's just these concepts where they say, oh, if you don't change, it's your fault. Well, yeah, at the core of it. But when they start manipulating reality, so there's this thing where they go, oh, if you pay lots of money for it, you appreciate it more. Now, there is an element of truth in that in terms of how our brain work, but whether you pay $200 or $2,000 doesn't mean you're going to, once it reaches a threshold. But you see, what happens is people start to use that as an excuse to oversell things.
Can I just present a slightly different take?
Yeah.
So for me, like Landmark and the thing of promoting, I had to promote Landmark on Landmark's behalf as part of my training, and there were positive aspects to that, which, because I would say it's a counter to nihilism, like for me to finally plant a flag in the ground and say I stand for this. That was helpful and useful for me. It helped me to cultivate passion, even although passion, you have to kind of like qualify what you're passionate about and whether it's, and that's a difficult thing. We used to have to, on the Introduction Leaders program, which was a 6-month program, I used to have to stand in front of the mirror and just like generate more enthusiasm for the sake of it, like smiling and getting more excited. And it's.
But is that, but if you have to do that, doesn't that suggest the purpose isn't there?
Yeah, but then look at the CIA and we are resilient. Look at us. It's like we should just be performing monkeys with all that we've been through, and we're not. So it's nuanced, and I'm not a performing monkey. And I feel like I gained a lot from Landmark. And I think the insidious thing perhaps is, and that is explored in more detail in Adam Curtis's 4-part series, 100 Years of the Self, which I would recommend to anyone, is that these encounter groups were taken over by government. And in fact, the Blair government was the first UK government to use these kind of encounter groups as a way to ask people what they want. And then you can kind of see the line in the sand with Tony Blair's Labour government, that it wasn't about working class anymore. It was about aspirational middle class. And they kind of they tailored the policies of the Labour government to the aspirations of the people. And that was because they did these encounter groups where they asked people questions about what they wanted. And consumer culture has done that as well. Corporations, branding, all that have availed themselves of the encounter group to mine information and data that we're now using tech to do the same thing. But that's the misappropriation of the encounter group, and then also people's notions of themselves were hijacked, so that they would believe that buying certain things said certain things about their individuality. So in the 1970s, a sofa was a sofa, but by the 1980s, a sofa was an expression of your individuality, and so was every other brand that you chose to purchase.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about associations. So we're actually coming up to time now, Françoise. It's kind of flown by. I wondered if there was any last questions you wanted to touch on here.
Well, perhaps we could kind of just give people hope. I mean, I think we're incredibly resilient. I think there's a lot of performing monkeys out there, but I am also seeing the awakening of a lot of resilience. And I think you've touched on this as well, that the overreach is actually catalyzing the resistance in new and powerful ways. Even us having this conversation and all the new platforms that are rising, like Substack, Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, all of these kind of ways of getting around the Googleification and the Wikipediaification, and all these traditional platforms are all being challenged now. And but I still think we need to keep it face to face, and that we mustn't use tech all the time to mediate our experience. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yeah, well, it's really key. So, I mean, I'm totally hopeful of the future. I think it's inevitable that the structures are breaking down, and what we see with our eyes and what's going on under the surface are two different things. People are starting, because there's a thing with a lot of these groups, when people get self-empowered, they don't need other people. And what are the most governments selling? They're selling security. So in order to sell security, you've got to scare the shit out of people and think they need you. And people are self-sufficient, they don't need that. So the thousands of groups that are popping up around self-sufficiency is that when they are successful, and they will be, people will gravitate towards those. We have lived historically in a society for the last whatever time based on false fixes, which is really just the magician's tricks. Once you know the trick, you stop falling for it. And we are starting to know the tricks now. So as this comes into the collective consciousness, people are going to change. People already know, like bullshit jobs and all these things. People haven't got the substance in what they're doing. I think it's really just time. I think there's this gradual shift. I think you're right about technology. We basically, and again, it's a false fix. This is supposed to connect us, but it does just the opposite. I was on one Zoom call where it was a person's birthday. We tried to sing happy birthday, but we couldn't get into resonance. There was something about being sort of 20 people on a call where we couldn't really truly get a resonance, whereas in person you can. So what I think is going to happen is that naturally people are going to move away from these things, because once they become conscious that if you find out about dopamine hits and then you play Candy Crush and you see what it's doing to you, most of the time you'll stop. It's just this level of awareness that has to percolate to a certain threshold, and then you become aware and you go, I'm going to stop doing that because whatever. That makes sense.
And also, yeah, thank you. Can I just say one brief thing about that as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, like, you know how we tend to think, like, in first world terms, we tend to think that we are privileged and advanced and that the third world is backward. But if you think about our reliance on technology, and also what the WEF is warning about, which is like some kind of like internet takedown or cyber threat that is potentially imminent. If that does happen, then actually the third world countries are the ones that are going to have the most resilience, because they're the ones that are least reliant on tech. They're the ones that still have their more intactness in their community. Some of them might still have elders and extended families and communities and villages that can take care of their emotional needs, and they probably still have, some of them at least hopefully have agricultural systems in place that are local, where you can go and actually pick things from the field rather than having to go to supermarkets. And so the whole world is turning on its axis, and some of the things that we've taken for granted for a very long time are turning out not to be true. And so it's a trickster universe. and maybe there are some good things about that.
Well, the thing is, if you're less reliant on a third party, then you've got more power. Yeah. You know, and whilst in good times the collective may do okay in those sort of what we call first world countries, but it also struck me that when I would be in places like Thailand, then you'd see, you know, these families that almost have next to nothing, but they're really happy. They just seem to be always smiling, having fun, playing around. And then you have these Western families that have all the things that they could possibly want, and the kids are on drugs and they're, you know, getting into trouble all the time. So what appears to be one thing is not always the same. So yeah, that you can't, the things that are really important in life, you can't really put a price on them, and you can't really describe them in, you know, they're a lot of the time they're intangible to touch, aren't they?
That's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much for your time.
Brilliant. You're welcome, Françoise. So yes, I shall do all the recording and then message you.
Bless you. Thank you so much.
Cheers, Françoise. Bye now.
Bye.